All right, we're going to finish our discussion of the cardiovascular system, looking at the structure and function of the heart and blood vessels. So looking at cardiac tissue, what's unique about cardiac muscle tissue compared to skeletal muscle tissue are these special connecting points, the intercalated discs. There's two things we find at the intercalated discs. There's special structures that holds them together, tethers those cells together. They're called desmosomes. And then there's also special structures called gap junctions that allow an action potential from one cardiac muscle cell to go directly to the next muscle cell in this region of the intercalated discs. So the benefit of that is that the heart muscle, when it's stimulated to contract, it contracts as a unit. For example, the ventricles contract as a unit to make sure we squeeze all that blood from the ventricles to get the blood out through the arteries leaving the heart. And you'll learn more about the details of that in general and advanced A&P. But for now, just know that cardiac muscle cells are branched, like we learned in lab, and they contain these special structures called intercalated discs. That makes them unique. Sounds like we have some construction going on in the wall, so try to bear with me as you hear occasional pounding. Looking at blood flow, though, we can see here on the right-hand side is a nice little flow chart showing how the blood changes in terms of its oxygen content as it goes through the circuitry of the heart and the systems or blood vessels of the body. So blood comes into the heart via the superior and inferior vena cava. So these are the vessels bringing used deoxygenated blood back to the heart to be sent to the lungs. So the atria on both sides are receiving chambers into the heart. They always have veins leading into them. And the right atrium has the superior and inferior vena cava, which are both veins bringing deoxygenated blood to the right atrium. At the same time that's occurring, on the left side of the heart, we have freshly oxygenated blood coming from the pulmonary veins to the left atrium of the heart. So the left side of the heart we can see is red because it contains freshly oxygenated blood, and the right side of the heart is blue because it contains deoxygenated blood or used blood coming from the body. So as this blood comes in the right atrium from the superior and inferior vena cava, it flows directly into the ventricle. And again, the same thing is happening on the left side. Blood is coming in from the lungs through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, down to the left ventricle, and those ventricles are filling. Just passively filling, like filling water, filling a bucket with water. And then when these ventricles are about 80% full, the atria are stimulated to contract by the SA node, and they finish squeezing that last little bit of blood from the atria into the ventricles to fill them. As the ventricles fill, it slams the AV valve shut, and then the ventricles are stimulated to contract as the impulse travels from the SA node to the AV node down the bundle of His, the bundle branches, and up the Purkinje fibers. Then that blood is pumped from the ventricles out through the pulmonary artery on the right ventricle and the aorta in the left ventricle. So the heart is actually two side-by-side pumps acting at the same time. Now this flow chart here shows the pathway that one red blood cell might travel as it goes through the body and the heart. So if this red blood cell comes in through the superior inferior vena cava, it goes into the right atrium, which is right here. Then it passes through the tricuspid valve, which is also known as the right AV valve, into the right ventricle. So that's where we are here on the flow chart. Then when the ventricles contract, that red blood cell will first be pumped out through the pulmonary artery. So it says pulmonary semilunar valve. So this is the pulmonary valve. That red blood cell is going to pass through the valve into the pulmonary artery. This is called the pulmonary trunk, the base of this artery. And then it'll go left or right into one of the lungs. So that's where the pulmonary artery is. Then it's going to enter the lung tissue, and there it's going to pick up oxygen if this person is breathing normally. And that blood becomes oxygenated as it returns to the vessels through the pulmonary veins back to the left side of the heart. So here is where that transition occurs from being deoxygenated in the pulmonary artery, going to the lungs, picking up oxygen, and then traveling to the pulmonary veins. So here we can see the pulmonary veins. There's 4 of them, 2 coming from each lung, and all 4 of them lead to the left side of the heart. They lead to the left atrium. Then that red blood cell will travel through the left AV valve So we're at the pulmonary veins going to the left atrium, which is the bicuspid valve is another name for that, or the mitral valve, or the left AV valve. Those are all names for the left AV valve. Then it enters the left ventricle. So now that blood cell is in the left ventricle, and as the ventricles contract, it comes up out the aorta, but before leaving the aorta, it has to pass through the aortic valve here, and then it's going to travel onward. It might go up the arm or the neck if it's the brachiocephalic, up the left common carotid or the left subclavian. We learned about that in lab. So either way, that's going to travel through one of those paths. And then it's off to the body and will serve the tissues, taking that fresh oxygen that it picked up in the lungs and delivering that oxygen to the tissues. So be sure you know the pathway of blood through the heart. There is a diagram I put out on Blackboard. Under participation assignments, cardiovascular system, I would recommend that you print this off right now. Pause your computer while you print this, and then you can trace the path of blood through the heart. So the way we would do that is we would draw a blue arrow coming in through the superior vena cava into the right atrium, into the left ventricle, the right ventricle, then out through the pulmonary artery to the lungs, and that would be the end of the blue arrows, and then the red arrows would be coming back to the heart via the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, through the left AV valve to the left ventricle, and then out through the aorta and off to the rest of the body. So I would color code these arrows. This one would be blue, this one would be red, and draw arrows again showing the flow of a red blood cell as it would pass through the different chambers of the heart. You have another picture here that shows some of the blood vessels. Same kind of thing. You can color code this a blue or red depending on if it has oxygen or not. The nice thing about this diagram is we can see how and I'll post a picture of this online so you can see how the colors change as it passes through the tissues, and then also try to label these vessels as best as you can as well based on what we learned in the blood vessel lab. But I will post a completed colored copy of this so you can see what that's supposed to look like. So moving back to the heart, here is an example similar to that diagram we were just looking at that shows how the tissues change from oxygenated to deoxygenated blood. So here's the left side of the heart pumping to all the tissues of the body, and then as the body tissues use up that oxygen, the veins drain those tissues and carry deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So you can see the left side of the heart we call the pulmonary circuit because it pumps blood to the lungs, and then that fresh blood comes back to the left atrium, and the left side of the heart is the systemic circuit because it's pumping blood to the systems of the body. So this right side of the heart is actually a low pressure system, because think of the distance between your heart and lungs. As that right ventricle pumps blood out the pulmonary artery to the lungs, that's a very short distance, and there's not a lot of resistance to flow there. But in the left side of the heart, when we're pumping blood out this aorta to all the tissues of the body, that's a lot of blood vessels and a lot of pressure required to get that blood to enter into the tissues, the plasma components. So that is why we see the left side of the heart, this lateral wall here, is much thicker, because this is the stronger side of the heart in terms of the pressure that it has to overcome to pump blood. But do take note that both sides pump equal volumes of blood. It's just the pressure behind that blood that differs, where the left ventricle is the high pressure side and the right side of the heart is the low pressure side. So these valves are very important to keep blood flowing in one direction as it goes through the heart. So the AV valves and the semilunar valves at the base of the pulmonary artery and the aorta are really important for preventing blood from going back into the chamber that it came from. So it's very important that these valves function properly, and if they don't, we end up with what's called a heart murmur, and that's where valves are not functioning properly and they become stiff or loose and they don't close properly, and then we can hear extra sounds when we're listening to a patient's heartbeat. Sometimes that will be a minor murmur and not a big deal, and they'll leave that alone. Other times, if they become more severe and it impairs blood flow and people have symptoms such as fatigue or shortness of breath, then they may go in and give that person a new valve, or if they can, repair the valve. But typically it requires a new valve. And that could be an artificial valve, or sometimes they use valves from pigs. So here we can see how these valves open. In the AV valves, remember, have these special strings called the chordae tendineae, and as the pressure rises in the chamber, that forces the valve open. And then as that chamber fills with blood, we can see here in the ventricle on the right hand picture, as it fills with blood, that pushes those valves closed. So the pressure of blood on the back side of these valves is what's going to force them closed, so that blood doesn't go back into the atria. So here's the atria here of the left. This is the left atrium, this is the left ventricle. As that ventricle fills with blood, that's going to force these valves closed. And this happens very quickly, the closing of these valves. Here we can see as the ventricles contract, it's forcing blood through the semilunar valves, or the pulmonary valve here. And then as that blood wants to flow backward down the pulmonary artery back to the right ventricle, that forces those valves closed. So the closing of the left and right AV valves, as well as the closing of the aortic and pulmonary valves, give the sounds of what we listen to with our stethoscope as the heartbeat. You hear the lubbed up, lubbed up, lubbed up of the heartbeat. That's simply due to the closing of the valves. So the first heart sound, the lub, is the closing of the AV valves, because that's what closes first as those ventricles fill with blood. Then when those ventricles contract, that forces the pulmonary and aortic valves open, and as that blood flows backward through those arteries towards the heart, that slams those valves shut, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, and that is the second heart sound, the dup. So it's a little sharper of a sound, so that's why we call it the dup. Where when the AV valves close, it's a little longer sound. That's why we give it the lub sound. So there's a little more, slightly longer time frame on that sound compared to the second heart sound. So again, heart murmurs are when you have something wrong with those valves that is causing backflow or leaking of blood, and then sometimes that requires repair, or sometimes just simply some medication adjustments. But either way, extra heart sounds always indicate what's going on with heart valve function. Here we can see the cardiac conduction system. We looked at this in lab. Remember, this is what stimulates the muscle cells to contract in the heart. So these are special muscle cells that can generate their own action potential, and these cluster of cells are found in the roof of the right atrium in the SA node, and there's another cluster at the floor of the right atrium, which is the AV node, and then we can see that pathway continues with these specialized cells all being able to make their own action potential. But the SA node is these cells can produce the action potential at the fastest rate. Therefore, they set the rhythm of the heart. However, if the SA node would become dysfunctional, the AV node has the next fastest rate, and that one would take over. If that becomes dysfunctional, then the bundle of His and the bundle of branches would take over, but that's a slower rate. And the Purkinje fibers on the sides of the heart also could take over the heart rhythm, but again, it's at such a slow rate that wouldn't allow for very good heart function. It wouldn't be enough to allow a person to get up and walk across the room without feeling short of breath and very fatigued. So we really need a functional SA or AV node to keep our heart beating at a proper rate to supply our brain and our tissues with the amount of glucose and oxygen they need to function optimally. So just be aware of the pathway through the conduction system, the order that the impulse travels. So it starts at the SA node, and that impulse travels through to the other side of the left atrium, so the left and right atria contract together. That forces the valves open. I shouldn't say that. The valves are already open as blood is filling, but that fills the last bit of the ventricles, and then the valves slam shut as those ventricles are full. And then by the time those ventricles are full and those valves shut, that impulse has reached traveled and reached to the bottom of the ventricles, and it's starting to contract. And the heart contracts starting at the apex, this pointed region, working up toward the base. It's almost like the heart is beating like you're squeezing out a rag. You want to get every little bit of blood you can out of that heart. Now, not every bit of blood actually leaves the heart, but there is a certain amount that is considered normal that leaves the heart, and there always is some residual left in the heart, which is expected and normal. But when we have too much residual left in the heart, that's when heart failure begins, because there's too much blood for that heart to handle over time. And if we keep having leftover blood at the end of a contraction, that's adding on to the next cycle where there's more blood coming into the heart, and that causes the heart to become stretched and then eventually oversized, and then you're setting up for heart failure. So here's an EKG. We talked about this in lab, and just remember that the SA node and the roof of the right atrium is where this electrical activity begins. So this first deflection in an EKG represents the atria depolarizing, and then that impulse travels down the wall between the ventricles and up the sides, leading to the ventricles depolarizing. And once they depolarize, we know that stimulates contraction. So shortly after depolarization, we would see contraction of the atria. Same thing with the ventricles after the QRS. And then repolarization is the end of the action potential, which means we would see relaxation of the ventricles shortly after the T wave here. So this is, if we have a normal EKG pattern, that's going to indicate that we have good function of the atria, and the ventricles are responding to the stimulus from the atria via the SA node, and the ventricles have a period of relaxation before they beat again. Sometimes, however, the heart doesn't act normally and it doesn't beat in a regular sinus rhythm. Sinus rhythm means that the SA node is generating a heartbeat in the ventricles in a real regular rate. So arrhythmia means it's not rhythmic and there's some type of dysfunction going on, or the person is under stress, maybe they're exercising. Those would be relatively normal situations that wouldn't need necessarily interventions. Tachycardia means a high heart rate. Normal heart rate is 60 to 100, so anything under 60 or over 100 would be considered abnormal. And if it's greater than 100, we call it tachycardia. Tachy means fast. Bradycardia would be anything less than 60. So the really slow heart rate we would call bradycardia. Sinus arrhythmia means that even though we have a normal SA node and we have sinus rhythm, every time we take a deep breath, our heart slows down, and as we exhale, it speeds up. And that's just because of the general rhythm changes that are associated with breathing. So we take a deep breath. I'm sorry, I think I said that backwards. The heart speeds up, and as we exhale, the heart slows down. PVCs, sometimes we get extra contractions of the ventricles, which is very normal in some people, and it's just due to a little extra stimulation that's happening outside of the conduction system, and the ventricles are throwing in an extra beat. And I do have a little brief description of that on Blackboard if you want to read about that. It's in our cardiovascular system folder, but that can be very normal. Sometimes if you get too many PVCs, you can end up with a rhythm called ventricular tachycardia, and that can be a deadly rhythm that's going to require an AED to correct, which is a defibrillator. So you'll learn more about that in your programs for sure. So the cardiac cycle just refers to the period of contraction and relaxation of the atria and the ventricles to produce one typical heartbeat, the lubbed up. So we call the contraction part of the cycle where the ventricles are contracting, we call that systole. And when the chambers of the heart, atria or ventricles are relaxing, we call that diastole. So systole means contraction, diastole means relaxation. And if you hear the term asystole, that means that there is no contraction, no heartbeat essentially. So asystole is definitely not something we want to see in our patients, because that is an indication of death. So systole means contraction, diastole means relaxation. So remember, blood always moves from areas of higher pressure in a chamber that's filling with blood to lower pressure where there's less blood in a chamber or a vessel. So that keeps blood flowing forward as long as we have valves between these two chambers to prevent backflow into that higher pressure chamber. So here we can see a typical cardiac cycle. We have passive filling of both ventricles. This is happening at the same time. And then as those ventricles fill, about 80%, the atria will contract, and that causes the AV valves to close, and we hear our first heart sound, the lub. And then as the ventricles contract, that forces blood out of the pulmonary artery and the aorta, causing those valves to slam shut as they fill. And that's the second heart sound, the dup, as those ventricles relax and those valves close. So we can see we have passive ventricular filling, then the atria contract and actively finish filling those ventricles. Then the ventricles contract. In the very beginning of that contraction, that forces the AV valves closed. Then the ventricles, as that pressure exceeds those of the pulmonary artery and the aorta, those valves open and that blood is forced out of those two arteries. And then as the ventricles relax, the blood might flow backward a bit, but that will slam close those pulmonary and aortic valves. And that's again the second heart sound and the period of relaxation. So we have diastole is when the heart is relaxed, and systole when the ventricles are contracting. So once the blood leaves the heart, it enters through arteries. Remember, arteries always carry blood away from the heart. That's a hard and fast rule. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. So because they're carrying blood away and they're under high pressure based on the heartbeat, these are very muscular vessels. They have a thick muscular wall in order to propel that blood to the tissues under pressure. So arteries have a thick wall. Then those arteries branch into capillaries. So here we can see an artery with a thick muscular wall, and there's three layers to it. There's the tunica intima, which is made up of simple squamous epithelium and some connective tissue outside of that. And then we have the tunica media, which is the muscular wall of the artery. And then we have the tunica externa, which is the outer layer, again made up of connective tissue. So these muscular arteries pump blood under pressure to get them into the capillaries where the nutrients and the gases present in the blood can leave the vasculature and enter the tissues. So the capillaries are truly the sites of exchange. So you should definitely underline or highlight major sites of exchange. That's the capillaries. They have very thin walls, so things can come and go and diffuse very quickly. So the walls of the capillaries are only one cell thick. Here you can see these are simple squamous cells forming the wall of the capillary. So very, very thin walls in the capillary. Not in the arteries. Arteries are thick-walled, very muscular vessels. So nothing is leaving these vessels across the vessel wall. The only place where we see nutrients and gases and waste that can cross in and out of the blood is happening in the capillaries, because these are very thin walls. Veins, on the other hand, are larger in diameter, so they can carry a lot more blood volume than the arteries can, but they're not as muscular. They have thinner walls, so they can stretch as they're carrying blood back to the heart. So here's an example of a vein. We can see it's much larger in diameter compared to the arteries, much smaller in diameter, and the muscular layer is much thinner. You can see how this is much thinner here than this one here. So not as muscular, but contains valves, which are just like in the heart, prevent backflow. So as blood is going from, say, your ankle up toward your heart, it continues in this upward direction, because as the blood tries to flow backwards, that forces these valves shut. So how do we get blood back to our heart then if we don't have a very muscular pump like we do with the arteries? Well, what happens is every time you contract your muscles, the blood vessels, the veins associated with those muscles are squeezed, and that forces blood upward. Every time you take a deep breath, that forces blood upward. And there's a couple other pathways or supports for getting blood back to the heart. But those are the two main ones you should know, is just general muscle contraction when you're getting up and walking around, and breathing helps return blood through veins back to the heart. So that's why it's so important for our patients to get up and walk around, after surgery, or even people that are not feeling well and they're lying in bed for a long time. They really need to get up and walk around to keep that blood flowing, because as blood pools and sits in veins, it can clot, and we don't want our patients to form a blood clot and have that get caught in an artery of the heart or the brain, leading to heart attack or stroke. Or it could even get caught in one of the arteries leading to the leg, or stay right there in the vein and prevent blood flow returning to the heart, and that is called a deep vein thrombosis. So we always want patients, if they're able and if it's safe for them, to get up, walk around, get those muscles contracting to help blood flow. Even if you're sitting in class or studying for a long time, take a break for 10 minutes, get up, walk around. That's going to help blood flow to your brain and get that blood that may be pooling down in your legs, getting it back to your heart and giving you good oxygen exchange. So as we age, if we have a lot of fat in our diet, a lot of cholesterol, some of that can actually adhere to the sides of our capillary walls and our artery walls and cause them to shut down. Here we can see some plaque, some damaged vessel walls because of fatty streaks of cholesterol, and as a result these vessels harden, they become less elastic, and over time if a blood clot forms here, that can break free, and if you have this happening all over the body, that broken blood clot can get caught in another part of a clogged vessel and cause, again, heart attack, stroke, or a deep vein thrombosis. So it's really important that we keep our vessels healthy by having a diet low in saturated fats, low in cholesterol, and there's certain proven methods of reducing cholesterol, and one is exercise that helps the healthy cholesterol do its job, and because the liver makes HDL, which is kind of like the janitors for our vasculature. It takes care of the LDL, the bad cholesterol that can deposit on our capillary walls. So exercise is a great way to boost HDL levels. People should get their cholesterol checked in their 20s. Some people think of a cholesterol problem as being something only for the elderly, but actually this process can begin in the 20s. So it's always a good idea to get your cholesterol checked if you're in your 20s or older, and see where you're at, because this process can start early, and you would want to make sure you're exercising or limiting your fat intake if you're going to be someone who has a tendency for arteriosclerosis or atherosclerosis. So as we age, what happens to our heart? Eventually that left ventricle, because it's working so hard, it gets larger because it can't keep up and it stretches. Too much blood remains in it after the end of the cardiac cycle, and it increases in size. So the word hypertrophy here means increased size. So the left ventricle is getting larger. And the heart can't pump as quickly as it used to. That cardiac conduction system isn't quite as efficient. The heart muscle doesn't respond as well, and the heart rate decreases, how fast that heart can pump. So therefore that limits how much exercise that person can perform based on the maximum heart rate decreasing, because it's not able to keep enough blood going to the working muscles. Valves, because over time they've been doing their job, and especially if a person has hypertension and an enlarged heart, that makes those valves work extra hard, and eventually they start to function abnormally and they become leaky, and people need valve repairs. We sometimes see patients on the floor I work at, usually in their 80s, that need valve repair, so it takes about that long for these valve problems to develop. And arrhythmias happen as well. The heart doesn't function as well. That cardiac conduction system is breaking down, not as well functioning, and as a result the heart doesn't have a normal sinus rhythm. And the heart muscles demand more oxygen to do their job. So those cells as they age become less efficient on using oxygen to make ATP to drive heart muscle contractions. So as a result, people become short of breath a little easier. They can't exercise quite as long as they used to, and that's all the just effect of normal aging on the heart. But it can be said that exercise drastically reduces the effects of aging on the heart. And there are people that run marathons and participate in significant amounts of exercise into the 80s, but it requires, constantly staying active throughout the lifespan. And even if it means walking, 20 to 30 minutes a day, that is a good amount of exercise, as long as the heart is beating hard and the person is, needing to breathe a little heavier, because the heart is a muscle and we have to challenge it. If we're walking, taking our dog for a walk, for example, and our heart isn't beating hard and we're just strolling along on the sidewalk, that's not a good cardiovascular exercise. To really strengthen the heart, like any muscle, it needs to be working a little harder than average. So try to step up your activity to the point that your heart is beating harder as you're walking. And that's going to build and strengthen that heart muscle to allow it to do its job better and longer and give you a good quality of life as an older person. So that concludes our discussion of the cardiovascular system.